Creoso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast. This is our Freeform episode number 4. And this week I wanted to spend a little bit of time just discussing kind of my experience coming into it as a non-British citizen, as a outsider, in effect, coming to Wales and kind of dealing with culture shocks and what those are, and kind of how I adapted to some of it, so that knowing that I was going over there, I also knew I needed to be able to adjust to what was not my usual, for lack of a better word. I have grown up living mostly in Western Canada. That's a 7-hour time difference from the UK. A lot of what I'm used to happens when most people here in Wales, I should say, are asleep, because most of the sports I watch, most of the interests I have are airing at a time when everybody over there is in bed. So when I went to Wales, one of the things that, or I should say England initially, one of the things that I had to make up my mind about was how best to carry on some of the interests I had in Canada, that, or even just some sources of things that I could find, depending on what it is. Like I said, cultural change is a little different, and how that affects you. So I've lived in 3 countries in my life. I lived in Canada, I lived in the United States for a couple of years, and I lived in the UK for 4.5 years. I can honestly say in the 2 countries I moved to that were not my own, there was definitely points where the cultural shock came and hit me. Now, there's what I call the immediate culture shock and the secondary culture shock. The immediate culture shock when you come from Canada to the United States is not there, because you don't have, especially if you spent time traveling back and forward between the 2 countries, there's enough familiar that you're not going to be totally shocked by anything, right? Most people talk like you do. Most people understand more or less the same things when you talk about different things that you kind of experience. You have a lot in common, in part because of the influence of American culture on us, and how it creates kind of this perception that we are similar. And in some ways we are very similar, and in other ways we're not. And sometimes those ways are very subtle, and they're in ways that we don't expect, and they're in ways that come out at the weirdest points in your life. Living in the US, for example, in California, most Californians and most Canadians, I think, with the exception of a few accental changes and a few isms that we use, are very similar. We both talk relatively rapidly. We generally speak in a similar fashion. That partially probably to do with the fact that when you grow up, you watch a lot of stuff from California. So you hear the accent, you hear different things quite frequently that show you California. So living in that area, I found it very much a case of, it didn't take much to get used to. And the only thing that I felt like where I was kind of in shock, like I said, are simple things. They're things that you don't expect to see. And when I moved down there, now, if you're from America, this is going to be weird to describe as an outsider, but as a Canadian, you'll understand what I mean if you've been to the US. One of the biggest things I think shocked me wasn't guns, because I'm going to be honest, that didn't shock me until later. And it wasn't that it shocked me, it was that I went into areas that were less safe, and thus there's a lot more gun violence going on, not that I saw any of it. So from that aspect, I never experienced it myself, but I heard it often enough. And so I knew it was much more prevalent and happened by degrees a lot more than I expected. That's an immediate thing, but there are little things that you don't expect, which kind of creep up on you all at once. So I'm giving the US example so we can go into the British example to kind of give you an idea. One of the things, of course, is that there is differences in the food that we eat. Not massive ones, because again, a lot of what we have, you have, and conversely, those things cross borders. So if anything, we usually have less than what you guys have. Your choices are generally wider than ours. Your options as far as anything from cereal up to fast food is very different because you just have more. So for us, that was a big thing when we used to go down to the United States when I was young. It was getting the stuff we never could find, like, weird things like sugar cereals or a particular fast food joint we just never got up in Canada, at least as I was growing up, and in most cases we still haven't got. So those kind of things were kind of big deals. But living in the US, I think the biggest thing that first jumped out at me was the number of flags that were everywhere, that were just put up on buildings, and not like, a school or a hospital or a university or something along that line. It was personal flags that people put up on their houses that were there when you walked up to the door and somebody had a flag on the front of the door. Now, I'm not saying that it was like literally a flagpole with the whole thing. And like I said, a lot of people listening in America are going to say, well, yeah, that happens. People are like that. It is not common anywhere else. Never done that myself. I don't know anybody in Canada that, well, I shouldn't say not anybody. It's so rare, though. Like, you can always tell, this is a funny little side story. You can always tell when a new store from the United States has come up to Canada because they put massive Canadian flags in the front of the store. And I always find it hilarious because we don't care. And we have no interest in that. And we don't do that. But when Walmart came up, they put one up. When all these other places, like when Target briefly made their appearance and then fell off, they all did the same thing. They put massive Canadian flags out front to, hey, we're Canadian, aren't we Canadian? And it's like, just be a store. You don't have to. But it is something sort of ingrained in a psyche that I'm just not used to. So that was one thing that was kind of a bit of a shock and took a little bit. Patriotism is very different. So that took me a while to kind of get my head around. And so a lot of the things like that would happen. And like I said, they weren't big things typically because you knew about most of the big things. None of it really surprises you in that respect. Like even gun violence, which was something I hadn't experienced till I got down there, was not shocking because we knew about it, right? We heard about it. There's a lot of things we heard about. Those are the kind of things that I noticed. And they're only things that really stood out to me living down there. And I know your mileage may vary if you live in Texas or Florida or Minnesota. Your experience is going to be very different because all of these places are very different. If you live in Canada, if you live in Vancouver, or you live in Coaldale, Alberta, or in, Halifax, or all of these places across the country, they're so different, and there's no real, you can't say one-to-one, this is what you'll experience. They're all very different. Everything about it is different. Culturally, we're different. The type of food that we prefer, the type of fast food we might prefer, everything can be different. But a Canadian will have certain cultural things that will cross the entire country, with the exception of maybe Quebec. But even then, you still got things like hockey, where there are equivalencies. There are things where we all enjoy the same sort of thing. We still complain about the same sort of things. Those things, are more universal in the country. As an example of my experience with the U.S., in reverse cultural shock was trying to explain why we had a queen at the time and why that would be something Canada might have. A lot of Americans were very confused about the fact that we had a British queen as the head of state, and trying to explain that to them was very difficult because they just couldn't understand why. And in the end, I just said, imperialism. There you go. Or more correctly, colonialism. And the fact that we didn't break away like you guys did. So those are kind of the things where you have discussions, and they're politics. They're sometimes not. They're different things. So when I went to the UK, of course, things grabbed you from the first and didn't let go. Other things would grab you later. Some of the things you suddenly decided, oh, I missed this, became very important, where previously they weren't. And some things you noticed where you kind of laughed because it's like, how does that work? So let me just go through this. I am not trying to, just to be clear, this is not a criticism of anybody's culture, because we all have different cultural things that are good and bad. We all have experiences that are different from somebody else, and this is terrible as somebody else is normal. And so we have to understand that. So keep that in mind as I discuss these things. These are a Canadian's perspective on things. So that Canadian may be very different than some other Canadian who might get over there and have a completely different experience. I might love everything I disliked or hate everything I liked. Don't know. So we'll keep that in mind as we talk about this. And conversely, a British person might have a very different opinion when they come here. I've heard a few of them. Root beer is disgusting. That's an example. It tastes like cough medicine. That threw me away back. And a number of other things. Your country's really, really big. You have too many cars. You have houses are very large. You know, all those kind of things that we all discuss amongst ourselves and criticize or challenge about each other. But for me, in a personal experience, so when I flew over in the very first time, and funny thing is I moved over having never even visited the UK, just never got the opportunity to. It was not something my dad specifically was ever interested in, so we never went over as children. Even though that's where his ancestry is from, he didn't care. So we just didn't do that. So growing up, that was just not something we talked about. My grandfather moved from Wales and was very happy to move from Wales and only went back many, many, many years later. Probably 60 years later, I want to say. And he didn't really miss it. And in fact, as I think I've mentioned before in the podcast, never spoke Welsh. When I asked him for my name in Welsh, he said Jonathan in a very heavy North Walian accent, which was like not exactly what I was looking for, so I was kind of annoyed. But he never spoke Welsh to us. He never said anything in Welsh to us. I had never even heard Welsh until I actually went to a library and listened to it for the first time on an audio translation thing. So that was kind of my experience with my ancestors, my relatives, in that it was not that they just didn't have an interest. And my grandmother, who did and probably would have been different, passed away when I was very young. I was 8 when she died, and so I didn't really get to know anything about it. So for me, all my learning came after the fact as a teenager and then adult. So I got to Britain. So to get back to the story, I get to Britain. I walk off the plane. I'm super tired because I didn't sleep. This is an unfortunate aspect of me with flying, is I don't sleep on planes as much as I would love to. And so after, a 9-hour flight, we got there. It's now 6 in the morning UK time. As you can imagine, 7-hour time difference. It's like midnight, no, 11 p.m. in what I'm used to time-wise. And then I had to carry on a full day. I didn't actually get settled until 6 o'clock in the evening when I finally got into the place that I was staying at, and then didn't actually get to sleep till 9 o'clock that night UK time, which was crazy. And so for me, I was already kind of in a bit of a wreck for a number of different reasons. Being overly tired was definitely one of them. And so the first problem I had, and it's one that doesn't really exist anymore because of our phones. You don't need this anymore, like calling for information. You used to dial 411, get the 411 in the old saying that used to clap around, which now nobody would understand half the time. Well, that doesn't exist in the UK. They had a totally different numbering system when it came to information, and at the time, I can't remember if it was just before or just after they privatized the whole system, so there was different no, it was before. So it was a one number, but it was not a number I was familiar with and didn't know how to ask anybody to find out, because trying to explain what I wanted, which was to find the phone number of someone who I had talked to over the internet and didn't have at that point in time because I couldn't get a hold of them, became very awkward and very difficult. So that was the first experience. Second experience was change, because of course pounds, coins, and various other things didn't look or feel the same or in any way resemble what I was used to. So that was a bit weird. But that was more of a fun weird. It was like, oh, this is cool. Whereas the other stuff became sort of an inconvenience that made my life a lot more difficult, because I just didn't know or understand what to do in that circumstance. The other thing was the fact that the emergency services are 999, which I accidentally dialed one time on a phone because of that. And I always appreciate the fact that it's 911 here, because it's a lot harder to do. And so those are the little things that you kind of have to deal with. Everybody talks about driving on the left side of the road, dealing with that from the perspective of someone who's used to everything on the right. The great thing is when you go to the UK, and this is true pretty much in every city I was ever in, that they have warnings. There's like a thing on the road saying, look that way. Whatever way you normally look this way. Because they're dealing with so many people who don't think that direction, right? Because when you go to step off, as a North American and probably most Europeans, you look left because that's where the cars are coming from. But you're supposed to look right because that's actually where the cars are coming from in Britain. So it says to it, look to your right, look that way, because that's the way that's going to be important to you. And so that didn't make that difficult. It was weirder when I was in vehicles and had to sit in what I'm used to being the driver's side of the vehicle and sitting in the passenger side. And the one time I actually got in a car and had to actually drive it, in quotes, I realized that all the pedals are in the same format, but everything else was the opposite side, which took a little bit to get used to. So like, for example, on a standard transmission, you're going to have your clutch, your brake, your gas pedal, and those were exactly the same, but on the opposite side. So again, little things that you don't have to adjust to, which is nice. Road signs are different. There's other things. Obviously, all of those things kind of have bearing on your perspective on things and how you deal with stuff. But those are the big things. Those are the obvious things. Those are the things that we all know about when we go to the UK. When you visit, when you live there, there's stuff that's pretty clearly always going to be that way. And they're covered enough in movies and TV shows and all of those different kind of environments that you're familiar with it. You're familiar with all that. So it's not a shock in the same way. It's different, it's unusual, but it's not a shock. I think the biggest thing for me was finding out that some of the things that I didn't realize would be an issue became an issue. One of those being housing. In the UK, houses are smaller. Everything's more compact. Fridges are smaller normally, or at least they were, because most people didn't buy for a month's worth of supplies. You didn't go to Costco and load up on big items or whatever, which may or may not make sense to some of you. But generally you would buy for a week or two, maybe, stretching it out. Or in some cases that was me too. You'd buy on a daily. You'd be like out to the shop, you'd grab something as you're coming home, you cook that up, that's dinner. Because you didn't have massive freezers that you used. Those are the kind of adjustment sort of things that you suddenly realize and you kind of go, wow, this is weird for me who's grown up with this other thing. And dealing with that is a little different. The smaller lawns or gardens is a bit of a difference for me in cities. Now, I will couch all this by saying this is in cities and it's an experience of someone who generally rented or letted over there and did not actually own my own place, did not actually buy my own appliances most of the time, so you didn't have the same comparisons. So with all of that said and done, and this was a very long time ago, where things were a bit different. So for example, a lot of what we do now, especially with like cell phones and especially smartphones, none of that existed. Texting was a big deal. When we got the internet on phones, it was terrible. So that was kind of the measuring stick. So for me, in coming to the UK, that was the biggest initial adjustments that I would have to make. Having children when I came over, the other adjustment, of course, was school. The fact that it started earlier than I expected. Again, North America, most schools start at age 5. In the UK, most kids start between 3 and 4 years old. And better, I don't know. I don't know, good, bad, or indifferent as far as that goes. So I can't speak to any of that. I just know that that's how it worked. That's how our kids attended school. And that's how we kind of dealt with it. And it was fine. Then the other major thing, I guess, would be kind of how, at least at that time, so again, probably things have all changed now, so keep that in mind when I address this, that paperwork was very different, that some things just didn't make a lot of sense to me. Like my wife, when she was pregnant, had to carry around paperwork to each doctor she went to. It wasn't that the doctor just had access to that information. We had to take it with us. And we didn't really have, while we had a family doctor, we never saw them. Because that's not how it works over there generally, unless you're lucky. A lot of the problems that they had over there when I was there actually have come to Canada now. So, like, family doctors are a big issue right now here. So that's not a real, that wouldn't be a real surprise these days. But at the time, it was shocking. Dentistry is a little different, which is another thing that changed. But again, good or bad, couldn't say. There was good and bad about both of it. But I think the other thing that I noticed, which became pretty obvious initially, was, at least at the time, I don't know if it's changed. I can't, even when I went back in 2011, it seemed similar, is that American style, my lovely British friends, is not American style. If you go to America, any more than like if you go to a British store, like where they don't actually buy, like say you went into a grocery store in Canada and you bought yourself what appear to be British sweets, right? Or British biscuits, or, you know, take your pick. There's a bunch of stuff that we have that you guys have that are similar. They don't taste the same. They just don't. They're not created the same way. They're not done in the same manner. We have different restrictions and different food codes. And so, you know, you go to a McDonald's over here and over there, they're going to taste different. That's just the way it is. The milk tastes different. There's loads of things that just are different. So when somebody says American style and they put big old stars and stripes on it, be it pop or fizzy drink or soda, using all the colloquialisms, or things like donuts. Seen that too. That was weird. What else that was really apparent? There was a couple of other things where they'd have American style branding and they were so not American style. It always kind of made me laugh. It was never something that I took seriously or got super offended about. It was just more the fact that it was so, one did not equal the other, so I just kind of found it very funny. But again, like I said, case in point, if you had a coffee crisp over here or a crunchy bar, or, you know, take your pick of any sort of dairy milk or whatever, they're not going to taste the same. They just won't. And that's something both my wife and I have made mention about. You know, chocolate and ice cream are better in the UK. Not even close. And that's the only problem coming back here. And I would argue that our chocolate specifically is better than most of the American chocolate I've had. And it's not even close. So, again, you might have different opinions, but there we are. So that's kind of, those were the kind of things that made me kind of giggle and chuckle. But there were things that were more difficult to adjust to initially, because you're sort of going, okay, this is so different that I have to get my head around it. And I think one of the things that threw me off initially, more than I thought it would, was how tax collection is done off of your employment. In the United Kingdom at the time I was there, the way it was done was when you got a job, you had to submit a form to say, hey, I have this many kids, I am married, or I'm not, or I don't have children, or whatever. And you would fill in all this information up front, and then forever after that, unless there was a change, that was your record with the tax people. Which meant, and some people will say this is a good thing, some people will say it's a bad thing. It's up to you to decide what you think it is. They collected all of the taxes. I never saw another pence back in a tax return. You just didn't do that as an employee. If you are a contractor or an independent person, you're going to do UK tax stuff. But as a regular employee of another company, you didn't. You submitted your paperwork, and that was basically determined that the government decided that this is how much taxes you owed, and you would pay. Thus, they didn't need, and they would put you on a code, and that would be the code that would determine whatever it was. Usually, temporarily, they start you at the highest code for your wage structure, and then you basically argued, hey, I have all these reasons why this shouldn't be this high. And then they would deduct it down, and then after that, it would be that way forever unless something changed. Those kind of things threw me off big time because I was so used to a Canadian system, and the American system is very similar, where you have to do your taxes in the spring, and you would typically, hopefully, get a return, although not always. Sometimes you owed money, depending on what happened and how much you earned. So that kind of thing made me very nervous, because I was like, do I want to trust the government to collect taxes? And then know how much I was owing them. That part was a little peculiar for me initially, so that took a little bit to get used to. And I've talked to other people who think it's a great idea, and I've talked to a lot of UK people who don't understand our system and think it's awkward and dumb. So, everybody got their own idea about how that works. The other major thing that kind of came about, which I think is more fun than anything stressful. Really, I didn't have any stresses. I had points where I missed things. Like there were times when I got very frustrated because we didn't have something or things didn't work the way they did back home, right? And those got a little irritating, but they were irritants. They weren't like, okay, this is it. I got to go home now. It was more, I don't like this. I wish this was different. And I think that was because of where we lived, because of the people we were around, because of the place I worked at. All of that was great for the most part. For a long time, things were really good. And so for me, that never kind of... The negative side of the culture shock was only temporary. Whereas I know for some people, it will always be, and it will always be problematic. So, in saying all of that, there is one thing that I hated and I never want to see, and it makes me sad every time I see it, which is hooliganism. Soccer violence, or football violence, if we want to be clear, is something that really bothered me because it's not something we experience. We do have violence at sporting events. It is not all the time. It is not frequent. I know it's changed. So don't take this as me going, oh, it's all the same as it was. Blah, blah, blah. But I saw enough of it to dislike it immensely. The tribalism that comes out of it really bothered me a lot because I've been to a lot of sporting events with fans of other teams, and we might have made fun of them, and I didn't do them. I will clarify this. I did not do this. However, I've booed fans of other teams. I've yelled at fans of other teams. I've heckled. I've done all those things. So I that part of it doesn't bother me. It's when fists get thrown. It's when, I hate you so much because you cheer for this team that I want to kill you or I want to beat you up. That I don't understand. And again, I know it happens in North America. I'm not blind to the fact that it doesn't happen or say it doesn't happen because I've seen it. A couple of very famous incidents I can remember from it being a child of fist fights in the stands at American, or I should say Canadian football games that I remember quite clearly and made a big impression. But still, we're talking one or two, not what I ended up seeing in Britain. That kind of level of violence and that kind of culture I struggled with a lot, to the point where I actually did not take my kids to a football game while I was in Britain, or in Wales, I should say, except for the national team, because the national team environment was a lot nicer. And probably because we never played England. And for me, that was the ones I took them to. I went to rugby games, probably had the best time at one of them with my son because of how nice everybody was. Because we got a ticket tout that sold us tickets, a scalper in North American terms. And we ended up with two seats that weren't actually side by side. And so what I did was I brought my son in and he just sat on my knee. And then one of the other people beside me realized what was going on, and they were like, they moved down to let him have a chair. It was such a delightful atmosphere that it was just, there was no comparison. And I always sat there and went, why are you like this for rugby, not like this for football? I don't understand it. And that didn't matter who they were playing. It's so weird. And I went to hockey games in Cardiff because, of course, they have an ice hockey team. And I really loved that. That was loads of fun. I took my family to those games. All of that was so fun, and yet the football became such a nightmare. And it so drives me insane. Now, why does it drive me insane? Well, one, I wanted, as a new person living in the country, I wanted to experience the sport that was the most popular. And so I wanted to pick a team. I wanted to support a local team. I wanted to support Cardiff City initially, because that's where I lived and that's what I was experiencing. And I wanted to be a part of the group and be able to talk about it and be able to because of my interest in sports. This made it a lot harder. And it continues to this day where I kind of go, oh boy. And I say this having been a season ticket holder for a local team here in town, once upon a time when they were here, as well. And I'll show you this now so you can kind of see if you're watching on YouTube. I'll explain it to everybody else who might be listening to this as a podcast. This is a photo of me when I was a child. I am wearing a soccer jersey, soccer gear, because I was playing, and I'm going to call it soccer because that's what it was when I was a kid in North America. I played on a local soccer team as a child. It was the only sport I was allowed to play growing up for various reasons. And so it held a lot of familiarity, and it was something that I remember quite clearly. And I remember the position I played. I was a midfielder. I remember, incidents that would happen at different games. One game where we had a field which was basically sloped. So half the game you were running uphill, half the game you were running downhill. Other times where a friend of mine was playing on the other team. I didn't even realize it till we ran into each other and kind of looked up and saw the other person. And there was the time where, and I played for two different teams and wore two different outfits. And I can honestly say, if you watch this on YouTube, the outfit I'm wearing here is basically the same colors as the team I support now because of those colors, because I was wearing that as a child. That is, honest to goodness, the only reason why I picked the team I picked. That and the distance from Cardiff. That was the other thing. Because again, I knew nobody would care. My kids could wear their shirts and they would not get into any issues. I could wear a shirt and nobody would say anything. I could wear a hat, nobody would say anything. That's kind of my personal experience with it. And like I said, when I went to the UK, I wanted to experience football with others. I wanted to enjoy it. I was very confused about some things right away, i.e. why the biggest thing that people would watch would be a highlights show at 10 o'clock at night because you couldn't watch games at 3 p.m. for some reason. And the only games you could watch were on a satellite network that was very expensive. All of those kind of things kind of drove a little bit of confusion for me. And yet, at the same time, I grew to love the sport as much as I did as a child. And for me, I still follow the team that I followed then. I still try and maintain interest in some of the other teams like Wrexham, like Cardiff City, like Swansea. All the Welsh teams I kind of follow. I do follow teams in the Welsh Premier League. Pay attention to Wales, of course. And I loved the Euros with them back in 2016. That was such a fun experience to watch. Completely on my own because nobody else here really gave a crap about Wales. But for me, it was a lot of fun, and I quite enjoyed it. Those kind of things you can kind of deal with because they're different. Some of it, it's just what it is. There were aspects, though, and I'm mentioning this one specifically because it's an obvious one, but also because it's kind of less political. There were some political issues that went on which frustrated me, but I don't get into that here. I don't want to talk about it here. But for me, that's kind of where I look at it and I say, when I examine what I loved about living in the UK or what I loved about living in the US or what I loved about living in Canada and still love, they are different, and the cultural differences are different, but that doesn't mean any particular one was better or worse. And it's just a heads up for people who may not understand, You have to understand that there are differences in how things work and be aware that your opinion may not be appreciated. So keep that in mind when you go to somewhere else and start expressing, blah, 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 blah. Cultural differences being what they are. We have been lucky to have the opportunity to go out to other places, to experience other things. And we learn by doing and experiencing what we like and don't like, right? Yeah, for me, that was kind of how cultural shocks worked. Like I said, everybody has different experiences with that. Don't take what I'm saying as being like, oh, there's a super big criticism of any one country. It's more of an observation of difference, which I think is important. So please keep that in mind. Thank you once again for listening or watching today. Next week, we'll be back with our regular episode. And we're going to start delving into the Chartist movement and leading into the Newport Rising, which is a big deal in 1839, as we jump back and forward between the decades in the 1830s and 40s, and continue to discuss the social change that's driving so much of what's going on in this time period. Thank you all once again. I hope you have yourselves a great day, and you can always reach me if you have questions, comments, or concerns at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com via email, obviously, or you can reach out to me on Twitter/X at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you would like to help out the podcast through Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions to this podcast, whatever they may be. Thank you all. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.